Joining us now is Milton Allimadi. He's the publisher of Black Star News, and he's an adjunct professor at John Jay College. Milton, my friend, how are you?
Hey. Thanks for having me on your show again, man.
It's
Hope
a pleasure.
You're doing well.
Pleasure.
Yes.
So, Milton, we had these deaths of these 4 U.S. Special Forces in Niger a couple weeks ago. I think from an American perspective, this is going to be the second time that Niger has appeared in the news, the last time being in the Bush administration with the uranium yellow cake lie, which helped set the stage for the invasion of Iraq. But this is a window into, in fact, a very aggressive space of U.S. kinetic activity on the continent. It also gives us a window into a lot of stories about regimes that we are supporting there, and various forms of politics that, unfortunately, there has been a bipartisan consensus on supporting in the United States. But can you just briefly explain the context for what happened in Niger, and specifically how many U.S. troops are operating on the continent right now?
Okay, to be honest, in terms of how many troops on the continent, it's even hard to know.
Right.
Because a lot of this, even some members of Congress were surprised to find out that there are U.S. troops in Niger in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. So I've seen accounts ranging from 800 to 1,000 in Niger alone. And on the continent, I've read anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000. And it could be a lot more. And specifically to that region, Niger, which, of course, borders Mali and also borders Libya and Chad and Algeria. And that's all a very volatile zone right now. So there are a number of stories in play, but let me try to hone in a few to try to make some sense out of all of this. Mm-hmm. First of all, we started hearing a lot more news from that region after the collapse of Gaddafi's regime in Libya.
Right.
And why is this key? Because both Niger and Mali, both French colonies, had a huge population of the Tuareg, who are known as nomadic people from the desert in Niger and Mali, who were in Libya. Many of them were working in Libya. Many also were serving in the armed forces in Gaddafi, but they're working in all sectors because their zone is it's very hard to exist there in the Sahara, right? Mm-hmm. And they've been ignored since independence in the 60s in both Niger and Mali. And many of them left and were working in Libya, trying to make a living there. After the collapse of Gaddafi's regime, they were targeted. So they returned, hundreds of thousands returned to Mali and returned to Niger, where there's really no form of existence except for what you can do if you're holding a gun. And you know what people do when they're holding a gun. So that is the broader context. In Mali, in 2012, there was a military coup which the French seemed to endorse. Mm-hmm. But then after the military got rid of the elected government there, the Tuareg saw that as an opportunity for them to fight for a separate state, something they've always wanted. So they started pushing from the north toward the south. And they had a good chance of getting rid of the new military government in Mali. So that's when the French, remember that big French military operation with thousands of troops? I think there was about 4,000 French troops with fighter jets.
Yes.
And they pushed the insurgency back. But also, as a consequence, sort of allowed the reintroduction of civilian government in Mali, the same military that supported. Now everybody was eyeing what's going on in the region, so it wasn't a good time to be supporting the military there. Mm-hmm. But during that time of the crisis, other groups had come into Mali from Libya, and those are the ones that were affiliated with the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, they call themselves.
Right.
And they want to set a more stricter a regime following the Sharia, or at least that's what they say in many of the videos that, they put out. And those were fighting the government in Mali as well at the same time. So there were two separate agendas there, you see. The Tuareg just wanted their independence because they'd been marginalized and ignored. But the Al-Qaeda entities And those are the ones that are pretty much still active up to now. And the French have been, go ahead, sorry.
No, finish your thought.
Okay, so the French based in Mali have been targeting them, and the French also based in Niger have been targeting them. But at some stage, the European Union and the U.S. had also now become involved, ostensibly, purportedly, in support of the French mission against the Al-Qaeda elements. But all of this also, we can't ignore another umbrella above all this, which is the economic interest involved. Mm-hmm. Niger and Mali are major sources of uranium for France. Mm-hmm. I think France powers its electric energy, I think more than 70 million, maybe even as high as 80% comes from nuclear energy. So that's why Niger and Mali are very important to France. And recently, the U.S., I think, have become more involved in sticking out economic interest in Niger as well, uranium as well as oil. And after that, China is now involved. Right. I think China won a major concession to bid to search for oil in Niger. So I think the U.S. has increased presence in Niger to try to counter China's influence. So that's the broader context in which all these things are happening. It's not happening out of the vacuum.
Right, of course not. And then just to kind of underline a couple of other themes here that are related to what you're saying, and I would like you to sort of accentuate. So number one, and I really like that you sort of positioned those different uprisings and their distinct claims, because this is another thing that's happening right now, especially when we talk about areas of the world that people have, that are undercovered and people have very little understanding of, and then to be just more on the less critical ends, that just more objectively, there's just less resources and access points to people having a solid grounding in what's happening in Mali as an example. But that Al-Qaeda and now ISIL, maybe in some respects as well, to the extent that they're sort of franchising and globalizing. There's two different...
Since 2015, right. Go ahead.
Right, and there's these different versions of colonialism happening. There's a neo-colonial move and competition, which is essentially another sort of West versus China conflict, and that's who's going to partner with emerging African economies, who is going to get access to this new wave of natural resources that people are quite keen on exploiting in Africa. We could also add some of the bioprospecting that, as an example, Saudi Arabia is doing in Africa as it thinks about, and all of the issues that anyone would expect, whether you're talking about the United States or China or France or Saudi Arabia, anybody that you would expect. People's land is getting appropriated. There's policies being written that favor corporations and foreign direct investors over local people. That's one dynamic. And then the other dynamic that is that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are actually running their own parallel miniaturized terrorist version of that same dynamic. They're going in and they're exploiting long-standing historical and contextual, and in many cases, like the Tuareg, legitimate grievances. And then they are ascribing their own just religious, fanatic, terrorist-oriented version of another outsider colonial narrative. And then the whole terrain becomes a battleground between imperialisms and colonialisms from the United States, China, the EU, then a colonialist terrorism from groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or their spin-offs like Boko Haram. Boko Haram is a good example because Boko Haram actually fuses some of those really legitimate concerns and claims and then have adopted the methodology and ideology of these global terror networks. So maybe you could just jump more into these multiple colonialisms and how they're clashing right now and how that leads all players to support some of the types of regimes that we're going to get into, including, of course, Uganda.
To be honest with you, the way you just broke it down, I don't see anything can add to that.
Okay.
Honestly.
Okay.
You broke it down really precisely. The only thing that is quite glaringly obvious, even to me listening to you lay it out, and to the listeners out there, is that really governments in many African countries really don't control the countries they claim they rule.
Right.
That's a summary. Right. Who controls Niger, really? It's not certainly the government there. It's not.
Right.
It's right now, the people that are actually in charge are the French, the U.S., and to a great extent now, China. You laid it out perfectly. There's nothing to add here. It just shows that we're at a space that is comparable to 1884, 1885, the Berlin Conference, when the European countries, they wanted to avoid multiple conflicts like this, right? Mm-hmm. So what did they do? They met in Berlin under Otto von Bismarck, and they partitioned the continent. They said, France, this is your area. Britain, this is you. Portugal, this is you. In order to avoid what we are seeing going on today. But, I was thinking about this as I'm listening to you, So we're seeing now the opposite of the Berlin Conference, when the partition was done in an orderly manner then. Today, it's not being done in an orderly, in a formal way. Right now, that's why we have these multiple struggles to stake out areas, and that's what we're witnessing on the African continent today.
And I want to be clear, the reason I break it down so well is because I read you. So that's
no,
why.
But the summary is perfect, man.
Yeah. Okay.
It's actually quite scary.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos